I would argue that any person who currently is employed by, owns stock in, or manages a forest products company that for so long have planted plantations of southern pine of one species or another throughout the southeastern U.S., you need to be taking this seriously. The trees you plant today may very well be the ones that are either not able to grow there or not grow at high levels of productivity late in this century. And of course, that is a business with a long-term perspective on planting and future shareholder value and harvest. And so these kinds of things in crops and disease and in forest products that are so important to this region show us that we tweak the climate, or we allow the climate to change only at our economic peril and with the potential loss of things that are important to us and potentially threatening to us in our livelihood. A British survey, the Stern Report, not paid for by British Petroleum or not paid for by the British government, concluded that essentially the cost of inaction was vastly in excess of the cost of taking action on some of these problems today. And yet, up to now, it seems that in this country and in many countries around the world, the enthusiasm for taking significant action to reduce the concentrations of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere has been lacking. People somehow hope to wake up tomorrow that this was all a bad dream and the carbon dioxide will turn downward in its concentration and the planet will begin to cool, or perhaps we can do something about shooting satellites into the stratosphere with reflective materials to cool the planet, that somehow we can continue on our use of carbon-based fossil fuels without altering this basic characteristic of Earth that has been so stable for so long at a level that's been favorable for human use. I would argue that it is highly unlikely that this problem is going to go away all by itself. It's not going to go away without a lot of enthusiasm and effort, and it's not going to go away without a significant cost to every citizen of the planet. The reason we're wedded to carbon-based fossil fuels is they have been abundant and they have been relatively inexpensive, and our society has been built and the well-being of our economy and our own personal feeling of well-being has been built on the idea of cheap, abundant energy in the form of fossil fuels. Anything else we do, which is either not on the table and available today, or we know about it but we're not using it because we know it's more expensive than fossil fuels, those are going to cost money. But we need to take this seriously because there's a huge cost to society, to our fellow citizens and ourselves by essentially not taking action and allowing carbon dioxide to continue to build up in the Earth's atmosphere. Thank you.
This one. Next speaker is John Christy.
Thank you, John. Someone's, oh, you are. It's a pleasure to be here in North Carolina. I enjoy being in this part of the world. Turns out my great-great-grandfather happened to be Sergeant George Washington Short from the 48th North Carolina Company E, which was not far from here. But that's a long time ago. We're talking about climate change now, and things have changed since he was around. And I like to call it climate change by the numbers, and you'll see why. Now, here's a quote I love. Just because an idea appeals to a lot of people doesn't mean it's wrong. But that's a good working hypothesis, and that was from John Tierney, a New York Times environmental reporter. Michael Crichton said this best: consensus is not science. You hear a lot of things about, but the consensus of scientists says this, that, and the other. Consensus is a political notion. It's not a scientific notion. But 150 years ago, Lord Thompson did tell us what it was. All science is numbers. So I'll show you quantitative information tonight because that is what I am as a climate scientist. This is a typical picture you see of global temperatures. That's a surface temperature measurement. It's very inadequate and prone to error, but it does show a rise in the last 30 years. And as was mentioned by Bill, 38% of the CO2 has risen 38%. That's a rate rise of about 0.6% per year. Here are some other basics. Carbon dioxide is essential for all of life. It is plant food in its best definition. In fact, 16% of the world food production is due to the extra CO2 we have put back into the atmosphere, where it used to be millions of years ago. That's a great benefit when you think about it. And the climate is always changing, so the global temperature is never steady. It's either rising or falling. Sea level is rising or falling as are glaciers retreating or advancing. So what we do in the science that I'm in, the specific climate science, is we test hypotheses about global warming. And we at our university actually build from scratch the kind of data sets that are necessary to test these assertions that are made primarily by climate models. So here was one of the first ones 20 years ago. James Hansen appeared before a Senate committee and said, this is what the temperature is going to do based on his climate model. The orange and the red were if sort of business as usual scenarios. It's actually gone up more than that in terms of CO2. The yellow one, if you can see it, is if we take draconian cuts in carbon emissions, drastic reductions in energy. 20 years later, we have global data sets now that can test this theory, and this is what they show. That theory, that hypothesis, was statistically significantly wrong. We can call it a failed hypothesis. And I show that today because the same kind of sensitivities in that model that James Hansen used are used in the models today, and that's why they don't predict too well. This is our satellite-based measurement of the global temperature, and it's much less. It does have a warming trend, and I think part of that is due to carbon dioxide, but it's much less than the scary scenarios that you hear about all the time. These are hard numbers, published, gone through the ringer of scientific review tremendously. Let's go to another test. These are 4 different climate models. On the left of each box is the South Pole, on the right is the North Pole, at the top's the stratosphere. So it's like a cross-section from pole to pole of the atmosphere. Climate models, and this is uniform in them, say that if you want to find the greenhouse effect signal, go to the tropics, and there you see a hot spot that I've identified there in those 4 models. That is where you will see clearly the global warming effect if it is due to greenhouse gases as climate models have. As you see here, it's kind of a cluttered picture, but the red line is the trend in the vertical from the models. What you see in the blue line is from actual observations. And so here again, the test in this fundamental quantity that climate models are supposed to get right shows the test fails. Let's go to California. Squeeze down the region here. You see here, this is very typical of all the model results there, that the Sierra Nevada mountains warm up much more rapidly than the lowlands. We actually built a climate data sets, and these are very difficult to build, by the way, but anyway, this is a result published a couple of years ago. Actually, in the valley, the temperature has risen dramatically. In the mountains, where the greenhouse signal is supposed to be most dramatic, there's none there at all. This is true for the snowfall, the river, the temperature, everything in the Sierras. We see no change over the last 100 years. Now, why is that valley warming so much, though? Here's a satellite photo in the summertime. The Central Valley is green there because of agriculture. It's supposed to be a desert. I grew up in Fresno, California. I know it's a desert, but because of irrigation, it has changed the surface development. The surface development has just changed the temperature in California. So if you want to return the climate back to what it was, you have to depopulate the valley and return it to a desert. That would be the quickest and best way that you could return the climate to what it was before. Let's go to the southeast where we are. Not one single climate model that we've been able to find has been able to reproduce the cooling that has occurred in the southeastern U.S. over the last 115 years. It's a little known fact, evidently, but the temperatures in our part of the world have declined in the last 115 years. That happens to be the temperature for North Alabama that you can see when your grandpa tells you about the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and early 50s. It was really hot back then. Let's go to a more fundamental issue about testing climate models. By far, the dominant greenhouse effect is produced by water vapor and clouds. Carbon dioxide is that other bar there. It is rising, as Dr. Schlesinger said. There's no question about that.